So this is chapters 9 to 12 of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. You've probably seen my last 3 videos. If you haven't, I suggest you go watch those first. So I'm working my way through this book. This is a reread for me, as I've mentioned before. I've got my steaming hot tea, so I will get started here. Chapter 9 is called The Sexual Cell, and this is Friedan's analysis of consumerist culture, the advertising industry, and how this all ties into her concept of the feminine mystique. Now, in my notes here, I have written down that I wanted to read the first page of chapter 9 for you. So that is what I'm going to do. After I find the page. So, Friedan writes on page 298, "Some months ago, as I began to fit together the puzzle of women's retreat to the home, I had the feeling I was missing something. Now, this I definitely mentioned in my last video, that there was some cause missing in her analysis of the feminist mystique, and she picks up on perhaps one of the missing factors here in chapter 9. She says, "I could trace the roots by which sophisticated thought circled back on itself to perpetuate an obsolete image of femininity. I could see how that image meshed with prejudice and misinterpreted frustrations to hide the emptiness of occupation, housewife from women themselves. But what power is it all? If, despite the nameless desperation of so many American housewives, despite the opportunities open to all women now, so few have any purpose in life other than to be a wife and mother, something pretty powerful must be at work. The energy behind the feminist movement was too dynamic merely to have trickled dry. It must have been turned off, diverted by something more powerful than that underestimated power of women." And she goes on to conclude that one of the things that diverted the feminist movement was advertising, was consumerist culture in the United States. Consumerism, she says, convinced women that to be happy they needed things. Wives, especially housewives, were underoccupied, understimulated, unhappy, and so advertising's answer to that was products, specifically housekeeping products, cleaning products, new types of vacuum cleaners, that sort of thing. And of course it was in the self-interest of the advertising industry, Friedan says, to keep women at home. And so to keep women at home, Friedan says, advertisers made women's menial tasks at home into a career, into an artistic endeavor almost, into something creative, into something worthwhile. You have the specialization of products. A menial task is no longer a menial task. It becomes a form of creativity in which a housewife is creative, in which she is a specialist in that field. She knows which specialized product to use when, which tool to use for each task, even if it might be quicker or more effective to use a single all-encompassing tool. She is going to use a variety of specialized tools because it makes her feel creative. It makes her feel like she is doing her job well and putting effort into it. Friedan uses the idea of guilting women into buying products and draws on young women who were investing in sterling silver products when older women were using stainless steel because it was easier to care for. But a lot of young housewives were kind of guilted into buying this sterling silver because it was a better quality product. It took more work to take care of. You had to buy additional products to care for your silver. Even though it wasn't necessary, it was seen as a sign of fulfilling your job well, of of taking your career seriously. Which leads us into chapter 10, which is called Housewifery Expands to Fill the Time Available. Now, of all the chapters in this book, this is one that I remembered most prominently from when I first read this 5 or 6 years ago as a teenager. It's the idea that you have a certain amount of work to do, but because you don't have anything else to fill your time with, because it is your only work, you expand the completion of that work to fill the time that you have. Frieden traces the idea to C. Northcott Parkinson, looking at the bureaucracy in the UK during the Second World War. He noted that they expanded the work to fit the time. Frieden applies this to housewives in America. Well, it may have taken a certain number of hours to do the laundry a decade before with supposedly labor-saving appliances. Instead of doing laundry once a week, women were running the laundry machine every day, which of course ends up taking up more labor in the long run, but they were stretching out the task to fill the time they had available to them. Frieden, as a psychologist, explains that women were exhausted. A lot of women were exhausted, not because they had so much work to do, but because they had so little work to do and they were stretching out these tasks to fill the time. Women who were working part-time careers were able to get their housework done in a smaller amount of time than women who were working just in the home, just as housewives, and not outside the home. Some women who were full-time housewives felt that they didn't have time to do things outside the home. And yet, as I said, as Frieden says, women who did things outside the home often completed their housework in a shorter amount of time. Chapter 11 is one that I remembered quite well as well. At 17, it's one of the first things that I read that directly addressed sex in an adult manner. So this was a kind of landmark book for me to be reading at age 17. But The Sex Seekers looks at women's relationship to sex and their desire for sex. And she suggests that a lot of women's frustration with their sex lives, their lack of satisfaction, was not due to sex in the first place. They only felt they were unsatisfied, or they only became unsatisfied because they were lacking in other areas of their lives. She is, of course, refuting Freud again. I talked about Freud in my other videos. She is refuting the idea that everything is sex-related, that everything comes back to women's dissatisfaction with sex. It's an interesting argument. I'm sure some of these women were actually dissatisfied with their sex lives. It wasn't always deeper root causes that had to do with personal fulfillment elsewhere. I'm sure some of these women were actually just dissatisfied with their sex lives, even if they were also dissatisfied with other areas of their life, like their career, like their relationship with their children. And that leads us to chapter 12, which is titled Progressive Dehumanization. And this is where Frieden perhaps goes a little bit off track of her main argument. Her main argument is about her main argument basically advocates for women to have a life outside the home, for women to have careers, for women to reject this feminine mystique that is damaging to them. But in Progressive Dehumanization, she's looking at not only the mental breakdowns of women, but also at the lives of their children. It becomes a little bit of an analysis of child psychology in this chapter. The problem was, Frieden says, is that women were trying to live vicariously through their children because they didn't have that life outside the home. This, of course, led to problems for the women because eventually their children are going to grow up, or going to leave, or going to leave these women with nothing to focus their energy on, with no one to live vicariously through. But it also caused problems for the children. She recounts child prostitutes, children stealing, children who were overly dependent on their mothers, who couldn't function properly apart from their mothers when they were out in society, when they were starting school for the first time. It's an interesting chapter. Not the most exciting or enlightening one to read. I think the next couple of chapters are going to be a lot more interesting because we start getting into Frieden's conclusion, her kind of call to action for the future. But as I said, 4 chapters here. Let's see, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yep, 4 chapters. The most pertinent ones, I think, are the sexual cell, which, as I said, deals with the impact of advertising and consumerism on women, on the feminine mystique, and the chapter after that, which suggests that women, because they had such empty lives, were expanding their housework to fit the time that they had available to them, which made them even more bored with their life, causing them to feel exhausted, causing them to take up drinking, to overeat, to develop mental illnesses, and then, as Frieden says in the chapters after that, that had an effect on their own mental health. It dehumanized them. It also had an effect on their children, their children's mental health. So, as I've said at the end of my other videos, if you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts on Betty Frieden's The Feminine Mystique. Leave me a comment, and I shall see you soon with the next and probably final video in this series.